Hello, hello, church family. Today we're going to be reading from Deuteronomy 19, 1 through 10.
This is on page 151 in your pew Bibles. When the Lord your God cuts off the nations whose land the Lord your God is giving you, and you dispossess them and dwell in their cities and in their houses, you shall set apart 3 cities for yourselves in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess. You shall measure the distances and divide into 3 parts the area of the land that the Lord your God gives you as a possession, so that any manslayer can flee to them. This is the provision for the manslayer, who by fleeing there may save his life. If anyone kills his neighbor unintentionally, without having hated him in the past, as when someone goes into the forest with his neighbor to cut wood, and his hand swings the axe to cut down a tree, and the head slips from the handle and strikes his neighbor so that he dies, he may flee to one of those cities and live, lest the avenger of blood in hot anger pursue the manslayer and overtake him, because the way is long, and strike him fatally, though the man did not deserve to die, since he had not hated his neighbor in the past. Therefore I command you, you shall set apart 3 cities. And if the Lord your God enlarges your territory, as he has sworn to your fathers, and gives you all the land that he promised to give to your fathers, provided you are careful to keep all this commandment, which I command you today, by loving the Lord your God and by walking ever in his ways. Then you shall add 3 other cities to these 3, lest innocent blood be shed in your land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, and so the guilt of bloodshed be upon you.
So some of us, when we come to church on Sunday mornings, we like to wear our Sunday best, right? We like to dress up, maybe put on a nice pair of pants, maybe a new shirt, maybe even a new jacket, right? And I think many of us, we feel like this is an important thing to do, right? Because, I mean, look, going to church isn't the same as, say, going to the grocery store. Going to worship the Lord versus picking up some bacon, right? It's not quite the same, right? So we come with our Sunday best to sort of show reverence towards the Lord. Holiness, the holiness of God, being aware of that, showing reverence. Also, perhaps we dress up, we put on our Sunday best because it reminds us of the newness of life that we have in Christ. Where the old life, the stains of our old life are washed away. And so our outfits sort of symbolically represent this newness of life that we have. And I think that's a wonderful thing. I encourage you, go ahead, wear your Sunday best. Of course, coming in our Sunday best can have a downside as well. And that is that its symbolism can almost perpetuate a sort of a culture of hypocrisy. Where when you come to church, right, well, you put on your Sunday best. You put on your good face. You come and you hold hands with your wife. And you're sitting in the pew, and then in the greeting time, how are you doing? Oh, we're great, fabulous, life's so good, never been better. Despite the fact that the entire drive to church, you were yelling and screaming at each other all the way here, right? But no, we put on our Sunday best, and it kind of creates this culture of hypocrisy. Today we are continuing in our series called 10 in 3, the 10 Commandments in the third millennium. And this is really a series on the book of Deuteronomy, because what we're seeing is that the rest of the book of Deuteronomy helps to elucidate, bring to light a deeper understanding of the 10 Commandments themselves. That many scholars see that the structure of the 10 Commandments, as found in Deuteronomy 5, is then paralleled with the structure of much of the book of Deuteronomy. So, for example, the first 4 commandments generally are understood as commandments about loving God. And we discover that chapters 6 through 16 Deuteronomy 6 through 16, those passages tend to be about our relationship with God, loving God. Now, the last 6 commandments, they tend to all be about our relationship with one another. And sure enough, what we discover is that chapters 17 through 26 in the book of Deuteronomy tend to deal with human relationships. And of course, chapter 19, from which we had our passage read today, is no exception. And I would say that the issue that is addressed here in chapter 19 is the issue of conflict. Conflict in human relationships, right? What happens? What do we do with conflict in relationships? And I think the first thing that emerges from this passage is simply this. Conflict is inevitable. Within human relationships, conflict is inevitable, right? And this is almost presupposed in this passage. You notice this, what's going on here? Well, Moses, he tells the Israelites, they're standing on the banks of the Jordan River, getting ready to go into the promised land after being delivered from Egypt and wandering through the desert for 40 years. Now they're standing on the banks of the Jordan River, getting ready to go into the promised land. And notice, what does he tell them to do? He says, well, set up these cities of refuge. Well, what are these cities of refuge for? Well, these cities of refuge are there so that when conflict emerges, you can flee to this city of refuge. If somebody's coming after you, somebody's mad at you, you can go to the city of refuge, and then the community can help kind of interject and help work through the issue and figure out what's going on and all of that. But notice that it's presupposed that there's going to be conflict in the first place. Otherwise, you wouldn't need these cities of refuge. Friends, you need to realize this. In all relationships, conflict is inevitable. You see, some of us, I think, we sometimes run from one relationship to another relationship, like looking for that one, well, that won't have conflict. That's not going to happen. We might even go from one job to the next job because, well, there's so much conflict going on, and the people at my work, they're terrible. So then you move to the next job, and then the problem is then you discover they're terrible too. So then you move to the next job, right? And you're, everywhere you go, it seems, you run into conflict. I remember when I was living in Loveland, I discovered that you can have conflict with your neighbors. I lived in Loveland, Colorado for a while, and this is many years ago. I lived in this little house, and it was a cute little house. It was kind of an interesting design where the entrance to the house was on the side, one of the sides of the house, and then the mailbox was on the other side of the house. So I would enter on one side, and the side where the entrance was, my neighbor on that side was really nice. He was cool. He was actually my landlord. Good guy. But the guy next to me on the other side, look, I don't know what to say. He's just a little weird. A little something, I'm not sure what was going on there, just a little bit weird. So I tried to keep my distance. But I had to check my mail, from time to time. Well, one time I come home, and it's after midnight. But I really wanted to check the mail because I was expecting something important. I can't remember what it was. So I'm like, well, he's probably asleep, and I'll just sneak around there. So I sneak around to the other side of the house, and I tiptoe, and I open up the mailbox, and as I'm reaching into the mailbox, I hear this voice behind me coming from my neighbor's house, and this is what I hear. You better run, son. I'm not kidding. I'm pulling my mail out. You better run, son. I froze. I just stood there for I don't know how long. And then all of a sudden, I went from freezing to the fastest run I've ever had in my life. I just bolted it out of there, run around the side of the house. I'm sure the guy was just laughing his head off. Conflict is inevitable. Conflict is inevitable. Conflict is inevitable in relationships. Look, here's the truth. You can show up here with your family in your Sunday best with your happy smiles, and all we see right through it. We do. We know. We know that's not often how it really is at home. We know there's conflict there, so sure, show up looking good with your face. We know that that's not always the way it is because conflict is inevitable. That is the first thing that emerges here. You can't run from it. Now, the question then becomes, if we just settle into that truth that conflict is inevitable, then the question becomes, how do we deal with conflict when it comes? And the primary principle that emerges from this text is this. Seek justice, not escalation. seek fairness, not escalation. Because what we discover here is that our natural tendency in the face of conflict is to escalate the conflict. And this is precisely what emerges here in this story of the faulty axe head. Right? Let me read it for you. Okay. This is chapter 19, verses 4 through 6. If anyone kills his neighbor unintentionally, without having hated him in the past, as when someone goes into the forest with his neighbor to cut wood, and his hand swings the axe to cut down a tree, and the head slips from the handle and strikes his neighbor so that he dies, so some conflict might emerge here, he may flee to one of these cities and live, lest the avenger of blood in hot anger pursue the manslayer and overtake him, because the way is long, and strike him fatally, though the man did not deserve to die, since he had not hated his neighbor in the past. Right, so it's drawing up this scenario here where there's this conflict. This man, his axe head comes flying off and hits this guy in the head, kills him. But it was an accident, right? I mean, so he doesn't deserve to die. Now, I know some of you, here's what you're thinking. At least this is what I was thinking. I'm thinking, really, it was an accident? Really? The axe head just flew off the handle and hit him in the head? Here's the interesting thing. In the ancient Near East, apparently, this was not all that uncommon for an axe head to come flying off the handle. In fact, this isn't even the only place in the Old Testament where we hear a story about an axe head that flies off the handle. Many of you may know a more sort of famous story about an axe head flying off the handle. It occurs in 2 Kings, the book 2 Kings, where the prophet Elisha, he's out with his buddies, and they're chopping, right? They're chopping down trees with their axes, and sure enough, one of the guys that he's with, he swings, and the axe head flies off of the handle. This time it doesn't hit anybody in the head. It lands in the Jordan River. You remember this? And it falls to the bottom of the Jordan River. Now, the guy who lost his axe head, he is completely depressed. He is really bummed out. It actually says in the text that it was an iron axe head, an axe head made of iron, right? And this is kind of 8th century BC. This is sort of the beginning of the Iron Age. Well, actually, it was sort of the beginning of the Iron Age for the Israelites. They were a little bit late to the party. They're like the last guys on the block to get into iron. While everybody else on the block is using iron tools, they're still stuck in the Bronze Age. That's sort of like maybe you're the last one on your block to get a smartphone. Everybody else got a smartphone. You're walking around with your flip phone, right? Well, that was the Israelites. Everybody else is walking around with iron tools. They're still walking around with their bronze-made tools. And so this guy finally, right, he finally gets his iron axe head. Think about that. When you first got your smartphone, everybody else had them for years. You finally got yours. But then imagine this. You had that thing for 3 months. And you drop 2 months. Yeah, this actually happened to my wife. This is why I'm sharing the story. You had this thing for 2 months, and you drop it. It lands on the kitchen floor, and it breaks the screen. And the warranties are terrible. Nobody wants to help you out. So you can't get there it is right there. You can see Exhibit A at some point if you'd like to, right? So you all know what this is about. You just got this new smartphone. There it is. Oh, well, that's how it was for this guy with his iron axe head. I mean, he loved his iron axe. It was probably showing everybody, hey, everybody, look at my new iron axe head, all this. And there it is at the bottom of the Jordan River. Warranties in the ancient Near East are even worse than they are today. This guy is not getting anything for this, so he's really bummed out. Now, fortunately, it's good to have a prophet as your friend. Get this. Other than Jesus, nobody in the Old Testament performs more miracles than the prophet Elisha. That's a good guy to have as your friend. And so sure enough, Elisha performs this miracle, and the axe head, right, it floats up, comes up, floats on top of the Jordan River. The guy is able to retrieve his axe head. Okay, now why am I telling all this? I'm telling you this because apparently an axe head flying off the handle was not all that uncommon in that day and age. Axes are only mentioned 10 times in the Old Testament, and in 2 of those occasions, it's in the context of an axe head flying off the handle. In fact, we discover even in the language itself here, the way Moses words this whole story, he makes it clear this is kind of a common occurrence. Notice this again. I'll read again. If anyone kills his neighbor unintentionally without having hated him in the past, as when someone goes into the forest with his neighbor to cut wood. He's like, like when a guy goes into the woods and his axe head flies off. So you can imagine him telling this story, and they're standing on the banks of the Jordan River, and the Israelites are listening to him tell this story about this guy who swings an axe, and the axe head flies off, and they're all nodding their heads, like, oh, yeah, I've seen this before. One of them probably mutters under his breath, oh, that's how we lost Uncle Mordecai. Somebody's axe head just flew off, bam, popped him in the melon. I mean, they're used to this, right? So in other words, it's not unbelievable to think that this really is an accident. In fact, he goes on, the text goes on to make it clear that there's no reason for motive. There's no reason to think this guy has something against him. It says twice that he didn't hate him in the past. You notice this? Having not hated him in the past, it's not like we saw these guys fighting the day before, and now you got to wonder, was this really an accident? Okay, so it's clear this is an accident. The point is, this guy does not deserve to die. But what happens? What happens? Well, again, verse 6. So they set up these cities of refuge because lest the avenger of blood in hot anger pursue the manslayer and overtake him. Now here the idea is that whoever is killed, right, probably his family, right, they're emotionally distraught. And so maybe the brother of the deceased, he comes after him. In hot anger, he flies off the handle, right? Like the axe head flew off the handle. Now he flies off the handle. Seems like this is actually where we get that expression, to fly off the handle. Just like an axe head that flies off the handle. Now this guy flies off the handle, and he's coming after him in hot pursuit because in the midst of conflict, the tendency is for things to escalate. Right, this Sunday, it's opening weekend for the NFL, so a bunch of games being played today. And football is, of course, a very physical sport. And oftentimes, conflict can arise. And the guys are playing. You got the wide receiver and the cornerback out on the side, and they're kind of fighting for position. Starts with a little hand slaps here and there, right? Pushing each other. One guy gets a little mad, so he gives him a little nudge. And then in response, does he give him a little nudge? No. What does he do? He shoves him with both hands. And then because he got shoved with both hands, does he just shove back? No. Now he's coming at him with punches. And then before you know it, the benches are cleared and it's on ESPN and all this, right? Because there is this tendency in the midst of conflict for things to escalate. And this is not just true on the football field. Am I right? How many marriages have been destroyed through escalating conflict? Wives, you have a conversation with your husband. You tell him, honey, can you put your underwear in the hamper instead of just leaving it on the floor in the bathroom, which is where the hamper is? Sure, honey, no problem. Yeah, no problem. I got that right. The next day, you walk in to the bathroom. There's the hamper, and there's the underwear sitting right on the floor right next to the hamper. So what do? You know what you do? I'm going to go shopping. So you go out, you go shopping, and you go get 3 pairs of jeans and a couple of shirts and some new shoes. And you go, I'll show him. He's not leaving the underwear on the floor next to the hamper next time. Or you go out shopping, you have this shopping spree, right? And in the moment, it feels right. I mean, how dare you do that? So then you come home with your clothes and your pants and your shirts and your shoes, and he sees it, and he's like, what? You went shopping? Are you serious? I'll show her. I'm going to go out and get myself a Tesla, right? So he goes out and gets himself a Tesla, right? It escalates. In conflict, the tendency is for things to escalate. And this is why, in the Old Testament law, and we find this at the end of this chapter, we find a famous verse which is often referred to as the lex talionis. Lex talionis, which is Latin for such retaliation. And it's a phrase that's referring to this concept that the retaliation should be equal to whatever the offense was. It shouldn't escalate. And here, of course, is the famous verse. It says this, it shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. And you see, this whole concept of the lex talionis It was given with the intention of restraining escalation. No, it's not 2 eyes for 1 eye. It's not 2 teeth for 1 tooth, right? It's about justice. It's about fairness, because what is presupposed here is that in our emotions, our perspective is skewed. As I like to put it, in our emotions, they weigh the scales. The scales become weighted. Here's what I mean. Think about a scale. It's hard to do holding a microphone, but imagine here, you've got a scale, and if a scale is operating correctly, then when you put an object on one side of the scale, then if you take another object of equal weight and put it on the other side, then it will show that it is equal. Now, if the scales are weighted, unbalanced, right, then if you put an object on one side of the scale, then in order to even it out, you might have to put something heavier on the other side. And you see, this is what our emotions do to our own judgment. See, we think that in order for things to be equal, we have to do more. We have to respond with greater emphasis than they did in order to make it seem equal. Our emotions hinder our ability to see what is truly fair. So this is why it's so important that we recognize our emotional state. Any Star Trek fans here? Star Trek, anybody? Yeah, Michelle, I knew that. Yeah, John, of course, I knew that. Yeah, okay, Star Trek. So in 2009, they rebooted the Star Trek movie franchise, and they launched, to me, what is one of the greatest sci-fi movies of all time. I mean, literally, it combines, get this, it combines space travel, time travel, and parallel universes. Are you serious? Can it get any better than that? Anyway, so Star Trek. So here's what's going on in this. There's this one scene where Captain Spock, he's actually captain of the Starship Enterprise in this parallel universe. Captain Spock, he's captain of the Enterprise. He has just witnessed this terrible tragedy where his planet Vulcan, has been destroyed by the Romulans. All 10 billion Vulcans have been wiped out. So he's emotionally struggling with this. And because of this, in hot anger, he gets into a fight with Captain Kirk and beats Captain Kirk up, beats him up right there on the bridge. There's this big fight. Spock just beats him up in this emotional tirade. And then while he's doing this, Spock's father comes onto the bridge and says, "Spock, what are you doing?" And so Spock kind of stops, kind of collects his thoughts, and then he turns to McCoy, the doctor. And listen to what he said. This is what he says to McCoy. "Doctor, I am no longer fit for duty. I hereby relinquish my command based on the fact that I have been emotionally compromised." You think maybe we could all learn a lesson from Mr. Spock? If in the heat of our conflict we could realize when we are emotionally compromised. This just might save somebody their job. This just might save a marriage. The problem is, this is incredibly hard to do. This is incredibly hard to do, and part of the reason why this is incredibly hard to do is because most of us are not half Vulcan. You see, Spock's half Vulcan, half human, and the Vulcans, they don't have any emotions. So it's really only half of him that gets emotional, and then his Vulcan side kicks in, he's able to be logical. But am I right? I don't think there's anybody here who is half Vulcan. We are all full-blooded sons of Adam and daughters of Eve. We are human beings. And this is why it's very difficult for us to do this. This is why we need community. This is why they set up these cities of refuge. The whole idea is that you could flee to this city of refuge, and then the community can evaluate what's going on, and they can determine what is the just and fair thing to do. This is why we need just systems of government. This is why we have trial by jury, where when they pick members of the jury, what do? They try to pick people who are not going to be emotionally caught up in whatever the issue was, so that this outside perspective can look in and can see what really might be just. Friends, this is why we need community. This is why we need the church. Friends, don't just show up in your Sunday best. Maybe on Sunday morning, there's a lot of us here. You all don't need to come in here and divulge all your problems here for an hour here. But we need to build relationships within the church. This is why community groups are so important. This is why finding people within the church in whom you can confide, that you can talk with, you can share about the problems that you're having at work, and how you can share your anger and frustration, and they can help you to see that and sort of see it with maybe an objective lens. You need people whom you can share about what's going on in your marriage, and then they can determine, like, you know what, buddy, guess what? I don't think it's your wife that's crazy. We need community in order to help us because of the fact that we can be so emotionally compromised. So what we see here, what this is trying to do, this whole lex talionis, an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, is saying don't allow things to escalate, pursue justice or fairness, right? In other words, right, it's not 2 eyes for 1 eye. It's not 2 teeth for 1 tooth. It's not 2 lives for 1 life. It's 1 life for 1 life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. We should pursue justice, fairness, not escalation. But I think that even as you hear me say that, I think we can all agree, well, that sounds good, right? Justice, fairness is better than escalation, but it doesn't seem quite right, does it? It doesn't quite seem like it goes far enough. In other words, the pursuit of justice isn't enough. It's better than escalation, but it doesn't fix the problem. Let me put it this way. If somebody gouges out your eye, and then the community decides, okay, well, the fair thing, the just thing to do would be to gouge out their eye. Okay, well, in one sense, this is just, this is fair, but did it really fix the problem? I mean, things really better now. If somebody kills someone you love, and the community comes to the conclusion that the fair thing to do is capital punishment. Okay, well, in one sense, we could see that that's fair, but does it really fix the problem? And actually, here is where we can see how Deuteronomy qualifies what we find in the 10 Commandments. One of the 10 Commandments, the 6th commandment, says, thou shalt not kill. But we discover then that, that the rest of Deuteronomy does seem to suggest there are some situations where that isn't always absolute, which is why many people translate that as thou shalt not murder instead of thou shalt not kill, because the idea is that there may be a place for it. Again, it's not vigilante law. You don't get to do a life for a life. Somebody takes somebody close to you, and the community comes to the conclusion that it was intentional. This is a homicide. And they come to the conclusion that, okay, now capital punishment, a life for a life, this is fair, this is just. But again, on one hand, we can see how that sort of makes sense, but does it really fix the problem? What we discover here is this. Do 2 wrongs really make things right? What we discover is that what we are longing for ultimately, what we really want isn't justice, but healing, restoration, and the fullness of life. That's what our hearts long for, not just fairness, but healing, restoration, and the fullness of life. Or another way of putting it is that we want more than justice, we want shalom. Shalom is a Hebrew word for which there's no good English equivalent, and so it's a word that just refers to a state of affairs where there's healing and restoration in the fullness of life, where things are the way they are supposed to be, they ought to be. See, that's what we long for, even more than justice. I mean, let me put it this way. Suppose somebody gouges out your eye. What would you rather? Would you rather have the guy who gouged out your eye, would you rather have his eye gouged out, or would you rather have your eye restored and healed? If somebody killed somebody that you love, what would you rather have? Would you rather have the person who killed them, would you rather have them killed as well? Or would you rather have them brought to life, brought back to life, restored to you? Look, we all know the answer to this. You see, what we long for at the deepest level is not simply justice. What we long for is healing, restoration, and the fullness of life. And here's the thing. Only God can do this. You see, the pursuit of justice can only go so far. In fact, here's what's interesting. The need for justice does not create shalom. The need for justice simply reveals that shalom isn't present. If you have to have a system that says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life, it presupposes that people are going to get angry. They're going to gouge out somebody's eye. They're going to steal. They're going to kill. So this system of justice presupposes that shalom isn't there in the first place. And so this is where we got to be careful, right? It's easy for us to say, boy, I want to get back to the 10 Commandments. I want to get back to the law of God, back to the way the people in Israel did it. We need to realize, wait a minute. Even then, like this, when they're coming into the promised land, it's not like they're coming in to a utopian way of living. I mean, from the get-go, Moses says, set up these cities of refuge. Because he knows that this is going to happen. Sin is going to happen. People are going to be violent. So shalom is not present. That's why you need the system of justice in the first place. In other words, what we see here is the incompleteness of the Old Testament law. Of course, this is a theme that the Apostle Paul picks up on in many different contexts than the one I'm bringing to you today. But he says there's an incompleteness to the law. Actually, what the law just shows is how messed up everything is, how messed up our society is. And the only thing that can bring shalom is not the law. Only God can do this. Friends, the heart of the Christian faith is that one day God will. Look here in Revelation chapter 21, where we get a picture of the age to come. It says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God.'" And then look at this. "He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away." And he who is seated on the throne said this, "Behold, I am making all things new." You see, the age to come, it's about more than justice. It's about the complete renewal and restoration of all things. We read a few verses later that certainly justice is a part of it, in the sense that those who are persistent in pursuing evil and wickedness, they are excluded. They are done away with. They cannot be a part of this community. But in the end, it's about more than justice. It's about creating this society of shalom. So the question becomes this: how do Christians live in the meantime? What do we do in the meantime before the age to come? And it's simply this: in the midst of conflict, show mercy. Because you see, mercy, what is this? This isn't just going beyond escalation. See, Christians are called to go beyond escalation to justice, but even beyond that, we go to mercy. In other words, we give and we forgive rather than retaliating or expecting anything in return. And of course, this is precisely what Jesus says in his own interpretation of the Deuteronomy law, and especially the lex talionis. Listen to what he says here. "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." There he is, quoting directly from Deuteronomy chapter 19. "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, Do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. What is he saying? He's saying, show mercy. Because what does showing mercy do? Do you know what mercy does? When you show mercy, you know what you're doing? Here's what mercy is. Mercy is a signpost to the age to come. Have you ever thought about, like, what is your purpose in life? I think this is a question we ask all the time. What is my purpose in life? Look, Christian, I'll tell you what your purpose is in life. It's very simple. It's that when people look at your life, the things that you say and the things that you do, it points them to the age to come. That's it. Your job is to point people as a signpost to the age to come. This is exactly and entirely what Jesus did throughout his ministry in the things that he said. So, for example, immediately before his interpretation of the lex talionis, he sets it within the context of the age to come. Notice what he says. He says this. He says things like this. I didn't put it on the screen. I'll just tell you. He says this, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." He's pointing to the age to come. "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." He's saying this is the context here. He's pointing everybody to the age that is to come. And then throughout his ministry, so not just in his words, but in the things that he does, his actions, same thing. What does he do? He heals the sick. He feeds the poor. He raises the dead. All of this is really just symbolic, a sign pointing to this ultimate day when there will be no sickness, where nobody will ever be hungry again, and when there will be eternal life. All of this is a sign pointing to the age to come. And of course, most significantly, the greatest act that Jesus did pointing us to the age to come was his death and his resurrection. On the cross, what did he do? He showed mercy. Instead of demanding justice, he became the victim of injustice. He turned the other cheek. Why did he do this? Because he knew he would be raised from the dead. And his resurrection from the dead would point to the age to come, this day when God would raise all people from the dead. You see, this is why we can show mercy to people, because we know that ultimately God will interject. And this allows us to do so. Friends, how do we live in the meantime? How do we live in the face of conflict? Show mercy. That guy cut you off in traffic on I-25. I'm talking to myself now. Show mercy. That coworker at your job stabs you in the back. Show mercy. Your wife goes out on a shopping spree. Show mercy. You never should have left your underwear on the bathroom floor anyway. We now come to our time of communion. What is communion all about? Communion is an opportunity for us to once again reorient ourselves, our lives, around the power of mercy, to reconstitute our faith in mercy and how it shows the age to come. The bread and the cup represent the body and the blood of Christ. They point to the reality that Jesus showed us mercy, and then through the resurrection demonstrated that God vindicates that. And so then as we take the elements, may we both receive God's mercy, and may we be empowered to act in mercy.